Imagine a country that was once America's closest ally in the Middle East. Its Shah hosting U.S. presidents, its military armed with the most advanced American weapons, its oil flowing freely into Western markets. Then, in a single revolutionary moment, that relationship shattered and never recovered. How did the United States go from calling Iran its pillar of stability in the region to being condemned as the great Satan by millions of Iranians? The answer lies not in religion alone, not in ideology alone, but in decades of broken promises, imperial interference, and a wound so deep it has shaped every crisis in the Middle East ever since. This is the story of how Iran became America's most enduring enemy, and why understanding its origins changes everything you thought you knew about the modern world. The hidden hand, America, Britain, and the coup that started everything. To understand why Iran hates America, you must first travel back to a summer morning in August 1953, when the fate of a nation was decided not in Tehran, but in the corridors of the CIA and MI6 in Washington and London. Because before there was hatred, there was betrayal, and before there was betrayal, there was Mohammad Mossadegh. Mossadegh was, by almost any measure, one of the most remarkable political figures of the 20th century. Educated in Europe, trained as a lawyer, deeply committed to constitutional government, and personally incorruptible, he rose through Iranian politics on the strength of one overriding conviction: that Iran's oil belonged to Iran. Since the early 20th century, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, a British enterprise, had controlled the vast petroleum reserves beneath Iranian soil. The company's profits flowed to Britain. Its executives lived in palatial compounds. Its Iranian workers labored in conditions that bordered on colonial servitude. Iranian workers were paid far less than their British counterparts, denied senior positions, and kept ignorant of the actual revenues their labor generated. Britain, meanwhile, collected more in taxes from the company's profits than Iran received in royalties. When Mossadegh became prime minister in April 1951, he moved swiftly. The Iranian parliament, the Majlis, had already passed a nationalization resolution, and Mossadegh made its implementation the centerpiece of his government. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company was to become the National Iranian Oil Company. The oil was to belong to the Iranian people. The reaction from Britain was immediate and ferocious. The British government organized a global boycott of Iranian oil, deployed warships to the Persian Gulf, froze Iranian assets, and began lobbying the United States to join them in overthrowing Mossadegh. Initially, President Harry Truman refused. American officials, many of them skeptical of old-fashioned British imperialism, saw Mossadegh as a legitimate nationalist rather than a communist. But when Dwight Eisenhower entered the White House in January 1953, the calculus changed. The new administration was deeply ideological in its anti-communism. British intelligence had spent months convincing Washington that Mossadegh, though not a communist himself, was dangerously naive, that his weakness would allow Iran's Tudeh party, backed by Moscow, to eventually seize power. Iran, with its long border with the Soviet Union and its enormous oil reserves, could not be allowed to fall. The CIA and MI6 jointly planned what became known as Operation Ajax, or, in British files, Operation Boot. The plan was elegant in its cynicism. CIA operative Kermit Roosevelt Jr., grandson of Theodore Roosevelt, arrived in Tehran with a suitcase of cash. That money was used to bribe newspaper editors to run anti-Mossadegh propaganda, to hire mobs to attack pro-Mossadegh demonstrators, to pay religious figures to denounce him from the pulpit, and to coordinate with Iranian military officers who were willing to act against their own government. The goal was to manufacture the appearance of a popular uprising against Mossadegh and use it as cover for a military coup. The first attempt, on August 15th to 16th, 1953, failed. Mossadegh's supporters got wind of the plan, the coup officers lost their nerve, and Roosevelt briefly considered abandoning the operation. But Washington gave the order to try again. 4 days later, on August 19th, it worked. Paid mobs flooded the streets of Tehran. Military units loyal to the Shah seized key installations. Mossadegh was arrested at his home. The democratically elected Prime Minister of Iran was put on trial for treason and spent the rest of his life under house arrest. He died in 1967, isolated and defeated, but unrepentant. Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who had briefly fled to Rome in a panic when the first coup attempt failed, was flown back to Tehran on an American aircraft. He would rule for the next 26 years as a close American ally, authoritarian, dependent on U.S. support, and despised by a growing segment of his own population. The United States did not publicly admit its role in the 1953 coup until 2013, 60 years after the fact. For Iranians, 1953 was not a footnote. It was the founding trauma of their modern political consciousness. Every subsequent grievance, every story of oppression under the Shah, every barrel of oil that felt stolen, every political prisoner tortured in the Shah's prisons, was connected, in Iranian memory, to that August morning when America reached into their country and destroyed their democracy. The CIA called it success. Iranians called it a theft, and they never forgot. What makes 1953 so consequential is not merely the act itself, but what it proved. It proved that the United States, when it came to a choice between Iranian democracy and Western oil interests, would choose oil. It proved that American rhetoric about freedom and self-determination did not apply to countries whose resources were strategically important. And it proved something that would echo through every subsequent decade, that Iran was not, in the eyes of Washington, a sovereign nation to be respected, but a piece on a geopolitical chessboard to be moved. The coup also had an immediate and profound effect on Iranian political culture. The moderate, secular, democratic nationalism that Mossadegh represented was discredited, not because it failed on its own terms, but because it was crushed from outside. In its place, two other political tendencies grew stronger. The communist left, already organized in the Tudeh Party, now had a powerful narrative of American imperialism to point to. And the religious establishment, centered on the Shia clerical hierarchy, began to articulate a vision of Iran's future that was explicitly anti-Western and grounded in Islamic political thought. A young cleric named Ruhollah Khomeini was watching. He was taking notes. The 1953 coup did not create the Iranian Revolution, but it prepared the soil in which revolution would eventually grow. It is impossible to understand why millions of Iranians were willing, in 1979, to follow a 76-year-old cleric into a confrontation with the most powerful nation on earth, without first understanding what happened on August 19, 1953. Every chant of death to America that has echoed through Iranian streets in the decades since contains, somewhere in its DNA, the ghost of Mohammad Mossadegh. The Shah's cage, Savik, repression, and the price of American loyalty. After 1953, Iran became a showcase for American Cold War strategy. The Shah was reliable, cooperative, and grateful. He signed agreements, hosted military bases, shared intelligence, and purchased enormous quantities of American weapons. Washington, in return, provided economic aid, military training, diplomatic cover, and, most critically, silence in the face of the Shah's growing authoritarianism. This arrangement seemed, from Washington's perspective, to work perfectly. It was, in reality, building a pressure cooker. The Shah who returned to power after the CIA coup was not the uncertain, passive monarch who had reigned before. He had learned something from the crisis, that his hold on power depended entirely on force and foreign support, not on popular legitimacy. Over the following years, he systematically dismantled every institution that could challenge him. Political parties were suppressed. The press was censored. Elections became theater. And in 1957, with direct assistance from the CIA and Israel's Mossad, he created SAVAK, the Organization of National Intelligence and Security. SAVAK became one of the most feared secret police organizations of the 20th century. At its peak, it employed thousands of full-time agents and an enormous network of informants that penetrated every level of Iranian society: universities, mosques, bazaars, government ministries, and labor unions. Its mandate was simple: identify and destroy any opposition to the Shah. In practice, this meant surveillance, infiltration, arbitrary arrest, imprisonment without trial, and systematic torture. Former SAVAK prisoners described techniques that included electric shock, sleep deprivation, forced extraction of fingernails, burning, and mock executions. Amnesty International and other human rights organizations documented these abuses repeatedly throughout the 1960s and 1970s, producing reports that received attention in Western capitals and were largely ignored by Washington. The State Department received detailed briefings on SAVAK's methods. American officials acknowledged, in internal communications, that torture was widespread. The response, consistently, was to continue the relationship. The reason was strategic. Iran under the Shah served multiple American interests simultaneously. It provided a pro-Western buffer against Soviet expansion in the Middle East. It supplied oil to Western markets and helped moderate OPEC prices. It offered military access and intelligence cooperation. And after the British withdrawal from east of Suez in the late 1960s, President Nixon designated Iran as America's primary regional policeman, what became known as the Nixon Doctrine in the Persian Gulf. The Shah was given almost unlimited access to American weapons and told, effectively, to maintain order in the region on Washington's behalf. Between 1970 and 1978, Iran purchased over $20 billion in American military equipment: jet fighters, attack helicopters, destroyers, tanks, and the most advanced surveillance technology available. American military advisors flooded into Iran. At the peak, over 40,000 American civilians lived in Iran, many of them defense contractors, technicians, and their families. They lived in gated compounds, drove American cars, shopped at American stores, and existed in a social world almost entirely separate from ordinary Iranians. Their presence was visible, privileged, and deeply resented. For ordinary Iranians, particularly those from traditional religious backgrounds, the American presence was not just politically offensive but culturally threatening. They watched as their country was transformed in the name of modernization in ways that seemed designed to destroy Iranian identity. The Shah's White Revolution of 1963 introduced land reform, women's suffrage, and a literacy corps, reforms that on paper were progressive but that many Iranians experienced as imposed from above and connected to foreign influence. Religious figures who protested were arrested. When Ruhollah Khomeini delivered a sermon in June 1963 comparing the Shah to the tyrannical Yazid of Islamic history, he was arrested and eventually expelled from Iran. He went first to Turkey, then to Iraq, where he would spend 14 years, watching, writing, and waiting. The gap between the Shah's Iran and the lived experience of most Iranians grew steadily through the 1960s and 1970s. Oil revenues produced enormous wealth, but that wealth was grotesquely unequally distributed. Tehran developed gleaming modern neighborhoods while rural villages remained in poverty. A westernized elite, educated abroad, employed in government ministries and multinational companies, flourished. Meanwhile, millions of Iranians poured into cities from the countryside, entering a world of urban poverty, cultural dislocation, and political suffocation. They found community and identity in the mosque, in the bazaar, in the networks of the religious establishment that the Shah had tried to marginalize but had never managed to destroy. By the mid-1970s, Iran appeared, to outside observers, to be a stable, modernizing state. American journalists and officials described it in glowing terms. President Jimmy Carter, visiting Tehran on New Year's Eve 1977, toasted the Shah as a leader who had made Iran an island of stability in one of the most troubled regions of the world. The phrase would become one of the most embarrassing misreadings in American diplomatic history. Beneath the surface, Iran was a nation in crisis, economically strained by rapid development and oil price instability, politically suffocated by SAVAK, and spiritually searching for a framework that could make sense of the contradictions of modern Iranian life. That framework was being prepared in the mosques and seminaries and cassette tapes circulating through the bazaars by the exiled cleric whom the Shah had dismissed as a medieval relic. The Americans had helped build the Shah's cage. They had armed his guards, trained his torturers, and decorated the exterior until it gleamed. What they had failed to understand was that the people inside the cage were not passive, not broken, and not willing to remain caged forever. When the revolution came, it would shock Washington precisely because Washington had never really looked at Iran, only at the Shah. America had confused the cage for the country and the jailer for the nation. The revolution and the hostages, when the break became permanent. The Iranian Revolution of 1979 was not, in its first months, inevitable in its anti-American character. It was a revolution of many factions: communists, liberals, nationalists, religious moderates, and Khomeini's Islamists, united only by opposition to the Shah. When the Shah finally fled Iran on January 16, 1979, and Khomeini returned triumphantly on February 1st, the question of what kind of Iran would emerge from the revolution was genuinely open. It was the hostage crisis that closed that question and made the rupture between Iran and America permanent. The crisis began on November 4th, 1979, when a group of Iranian students calling themselves the Students Following the Imam's Line stormed the American embassy in Tehran and seized 66 American diplomats and staff. Their stated justification was that the United States had admitted the deposed Shah, who had been diagnosed with cancer, into an American hospital for treatment. For the students, this was proof that Washington intended to use the Shah to orchestrate another coup, as it had in 1953. The fear was not irrational. It was, in fact, rooted in a very accurate reading of American history. What the students and Khomeini understood, and what many Western observers missed, was that the embassy they had seized was not simply a diplomatic facility. In Iranian political culture, it was known as the den of spies, and with considerable justification. The CIA had operated from that embassy. The 1953 coup had been planned and coordinated, in part, from within its walls. When Iranian revolutionaries had seized the embassy briefly in February 1979, they had found shredded documents that, when painstakingly reassembled, confirmed the CIA's operational history in Iran. In Iranian political consciousness, the American embassy was not a neutral diplomatic space. It was the physical headquarters of foreign interference in Iranian affairs. Khomeini initially hesitated. Some accounts suggest he was not forewarned about the students' plan, and his first instinct may have been caution. But when he saw the massive public outpouring of support for the seizure, when hundreds of thousands of Iranians took to the streets cheering the students, he recognized a political opportunity. The hostage crisis allowed him to simultaneously consolidate the revolution against its internal rivals, define its international character, and channel Iranian anger at America in a direction that served his political goals. The moderate, liberal politicians who had hoped to work within a post-Shah Iran suddenly found themselves unable to oppose the students without appearing to side with America. Khomeini used the crisis as a bulldozer to flatten his opponents. For 444 days, 66 Americans were held captive in what became a global media spectacle. The Carter administration was paralyzed. Diplomatic channels produced nothing. Economic sanctions had limited effect. A rescue mission, Operation Eagle Claw, launched in April 1980, ended in catastrophic failure when helicopters malfunctioned in the Iranian desert. 8 American servicemen died in a collision, and the operation was aborted before reaching Tehran. The images of burning American aircraft in the Iranian desert, broadcast around the world, were a humiliation for which the Carter presidency never recovered. The crisis also produced, on the American side, a hardening of attitudes that would prove equally durable. Americans who had previously known little about Iran now associated it with images of blindfolded hostages, chanting mobs, and burning flags. The nuance of Iranian history. The 1953 coup, Savak, the decades of American support for a repressive Shah, was largely absent from American media coverage. Iran was presented as irrational, fanatical, and incomprehensibly hostile. The narrative of Iran as an enemy, not a former ally with legitimate grievances, but an essentially alien and dangerous adversary, took root in American political culture during those 444 days and never fully left. The hostages were released on January 20th, 1981, the very minute Ronald Reagan was sworn in as president, a timing that Iranians later acknowledged was deliberately designed to deny Carter any political benefit. The release was negotiated through Algerian intermediaries, involved the return of frozen Iranian assets, and included an agreement that the United States would not interfere in Iran's internal affairs. That last commitment was, to put it mildly, not kept. What the hostage crisis created on both sides was a set of images, narratives, and political incentives that made rational recalibration of the relationship almost impossible for decades. American politicians who expressed any nuance about Iran risked being accused of weakness or sympathy for terrorism. Iranian politicians who suggested any accommodation with America risked being accused of surrendering to the Great Satan, a phrase Khomeini had introduced into Iranian political vocabulary as a theological and political frame for the relationship. The rhetoric on both sides fed on itself, deepening the estrangement with every passing year. Two nations that had once been close allies had, in the space of 2 years, transformed themselves into each other's defining enemy. And yet the hostage crisis was not the end of the story. It was, in some ways, only the beginning, because even as American and Iranian diplomats were not speaking to each other, American and Iranian interests were colliding in new and even more consequential ways just across Iran's western border, in the killing fields of Iraq. Permanent enmity, war, sanctions, and the architecture of hostility. If the hostage crisis created the rupture between Iran and America, what followed was the construction of a permanent architecture of hostility, built brick by brick through decades of proxy conflicts, covert operations, economic warfare, and missed opportunities. The most consequential early chapter of this architecture was America's role in the Iran-Iraq War, because it revealed something that many Iranians had suspected and that American policymakers preferred not to acknowledge: that the United States was not merely indifferent to Iranian suffering, but willing to actively facilitate it. When Saddam Hussein's Iraq invaded Iran in September 1980, The war that followed was one of the bloodiest conflicts of the 20th century. 8 years of fighting ultimately killed between 500,000 and 1 million people, many of them young Iranian men who died in human wave assaults across minefields and in chemical weapons attacks. The United States, officially neutral, was in practice deeply invested in the outcome on Iraq's side. The Reagan administration restored diplomatic relations with Baghdad in 1983, removed Iraq from the State Department's list of state sponsors of terrorism, and, most damagingly, provided Iraq with satellite intelligence on Iranian troop positions that Iraq used to coordinate chemical weapons attacks. American officials knew that Iraq was using chemical weapons, nerve agents and mustard gas, against Iranian soldiers and, later, against Iraq's own Kurdish population. The internal documents declassified in subsequent decades are unambiguous. American policymakers knew and made a strategic decision that an Iranian defeat was more important than the prohibition on chemical warfare. From the Iranian perspective, this was not merely hypocrisy. It was participation in mass murder. The United States had helped kill Iranians with weapons that the entire international community had condemned since World War I. This was not rhetoric. This was documented policy. In July 1988, the USS Vincennes, an American guided missile cruiser operating in the Persian Gulf, shot down Iran Air Flight 655, killing all 290 civilians aboard, including 66 children. The U.S. government initially claimed that the Vincennes had mistaken the civilian Airbus for an attacking Iranian F-14. Subsequent investigations raised serious questions about the accuracy of that account. The Reagan administration never apologized for the shootdown. Vice President George H.W. Bush, campaigning for the presidency months later, said he would never apologize for the United States of America, ever. I don't care what the facts are. The United States eventually paid compensation to victims' families, but never accepted legal liability or offered a formal apology. In Iran, Flight 655 is not a forgotten incident. It is a national wound. The end of the Iran-Iraq War in 1988 created a brief moment when a different relationship might have been possible. Iran was exhausted, economically devastated, and its supreme leader, Khomeini, died in June 1989. His successor, Ali Khamenei, and the new president, Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani, were pragmatists who signaled interest in cautious engagement with the West. There were back-channel discussions. There were gestures. And then the opportunity collapsed, as opportunities between Iran and America repeatedly have, because the political costs of engagement on both sides were simply too high. American politicians who suggested engaging Iran were attacked as naive. Iranian politicians who suggested it were accused of betraying the revolution. The mutual demonization had created its own gravitational field, pulling both countries back toward hostility whenever they approached each other. The 1990s and 2000s deepened the estrangement further. American sanctions, originally imposed after the hostage crisis, were expanded repeatedly, targeting Iranian banking, trade, and energy sectors in ways that inflicted genuine hardship on ordinary Iranian citizens. From Washington's perspective, sanctions were a tool of policy, an alternative to war. From Tehran's perspective, they were economic warfare against a civilian population. When reformist President Mohammad Khatami attempted genuine diplomatic outreach in the late 1990s, delivering a celebrated interview in which he spoke warmly of the American people and called for a dialogue of civilizations, the Clinton administration responded with gestures that Iranian reformists considered embarrassingly insufficient given the political risks Khatami had taken. The September 11th attacks created another fleeting moment. Iran, which had no love for the Taliban or al-Qaeda, Sunni extremists who regarded Shia Muslims as apostates, quietly cooperated with American intelligence in the early days of the Afghanistan campaign. Iranian officials provided information on Taliban positions and facilitated the movement of American-aligned forces. Then, in January 2002, President George W. Bush delivered his State of the Union address and named Iran as a member of the axis of evil, alongside Iraq and North Korea. Iranian reformists who had taken enormous political risks to support cooperation with America were devastated. Khamenei's hardliners, who had always insisted that America could not be trusted, were vindicated. The nuclear issue, which dominated the relationship for the following 2 decades, was both a real strategic dispute and a proxy for the deeper estrangement. Iran's nuclear program had legitimate civilian components, but also, in the view of Western intelligence agencies, military dimensions that could not be explained by purely peaceful intentions. Successive American administrations demanded Iranian compliance with international inspections and limitations. Iran insisted it had the right, as a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, to enrich uranium for civilian purposes. The 2015 nuclear deal, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, represented the most serious diplomatic achievement between Iran and America since 1979, negotiated painstakingly over years by Obama administration diplomats and their Iranian counterparts. It was by the assessment of international inspectors working, and in May 2018, the Trump administration withdrew from it unilaterally, reimposing sanctions and initiating what it called a maximum pressure campaign. The deal collapsed. Iranian hardliners who had always said America could not be trusted pointed to the withdrawal as definitive proof. What the history of Iran-America relations ultimately reveals is not a simple story of villains and victims, but something more complex and more tragic. 2 nations trapped in a relationship defined by a series of genuinely catastrophic decisions. The 1953 coup, the support for the Shah, the hostage crisis, the Iran-Iraq war, the nuclear deal withdrawal, each of which made the next step toward normal relations harder, each of which added another layer of grievance to a structure that now seemed self-sustaining. The enmity between Iran and America is not natural or inevitable. It was constructed decision by decision, decade by decade, by human beings who made choices, and it remains, therefore, a problem that human beings could, in principle, choose to solve. Whether they will is another matter entirely. But understanding how it was built is the necessary first step toward imagining how it might, someday, be unmade.